Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And I am very pleased to welcome my guest today, Sue Schneider. Hello, Sue.
Hi, Anna.
Your book is called Meeting the Moment with Kindness, and I just love the title. So, before we talk about the kindness side of it, for those who've heard the word mindfulness, but are not quite understanding what it means. They might have a vague notion. What do we mean when we use that term mindfulness?
Yeah, I love to clarify a lot of the misconceptions that are out there about mindfulness. And I'll actually start answering your question by saying that there are two wings of mindfulness. One is awareness, what we bring to the present moment, but the other is compassion. And that's where the kindness comes in. So I just want to situate it there by saying people often think mindfulness is just kind of sitting and quieting the mind, but there's so much more to it. The sitting and quieting the mind part of it is important. We often talk about mindfulness in terms of present moment awareness. And what we're really trying to do is just bring some awareness, some illumination to all of those things that are swirling around in our minds. We don't often take stock of how much we're processing or how much, just thinking we're doing, planning, worrying. We often spend so much time in the future mind, what's going to happen, what do I need to do? Or we spend so much time in the past mind, what happened? What did I do wrong? And we are simply not aware of that. And so, with this kind of version of mindfulness meditation that I teach called insight meditation, it's really an approach to bringing awareness to all that's arising. And the kindness part, and there's so much to this, but I'll just say this really briefly. The kindness part is actually dropping the judgments around what we're finding and maybe befriending what's coming up, and befriending ourselves in the process. And so that is the very kind of simple definition of mindfulness. And that is in practice when we're sitting quietly and paying attention. But there's also, and this is why I wrote the book, there's everyday mindfulness. There is being out in the world and being aware of our thoughts that produce our beliefs, that produce our actions. Bringing that awareness to that everyday moment can really impact what we're putting out into the world and how we're experiencing our lives in general. I'll kind of stop there.
Well, there's quite a lot in what you've just said, and I think for me it comes down to being observant, paying attention to what is happening around us. And I think it's so easy. It's difficult enough to do it when we're sitting still. And, that butterfly mind that we all have, it's difficult enough to do that. But when we're actually out and about, how do we practice mindfulness? Well, it's by paying attention. And you use the word aware. In order to be aware, we have to pay attention, we have to observe.
Yeah.
And that means observing ourselves as well as observing others. And, sometimes there are little things that we can do that can make a difference. So, one of the things that I've often encouraged clients to do who are struggling to still their minds or to calm down or to be calm is to, if they're out walking, instead of thinking about all the things that are troubling them, to start taking pictures of good things they see. Because now they're having to pay attention to what's on their walk, or to have a goal of taking a certain number of pictures of their children when they're with their children during the day. Because again, it's about bringing the mind back into the moment when it's so easy for it to be racing off, but usually in fear, fear or anger. Yeah.
Totally. That's correct. Absolutely. And there are actually two things that come up and kind of two branches of focus that we can take. One is if we are out taking a walk, we can make it a very, very somatic experience. That our awareness of the present moment actually can happen through the body. And so paying attention to the sensations of our feet on the ground, paying attention to the sound of the birds around us or the feeling of the wind on us, paying attention in the moment can be very somatic, and it really is based on bringing awareness to our senses. So those are really grounding practices. As you said, it's we don't have to sit and focus on the mind, but we can take it into movement as long as we are paying attention. The body is a gateway actually to our present moment awareness. But the other thing that you're saying about taking pictures of things that are important and special and beautiful is the gratitude practice that can come out of being present. Because only when we are present and stable in the moment do we then pay attention to the things that are beautiful around us, the blossoming flowers. Or my husband and I were taking a walk the other day. We saw a bald eagle. I live in Colorado. They're not super rare, but I've never seen one. Noticing a moment, noticing something that we feel appreciation for. And the next step of that, and this is actually Rick Hansen, a neuropsychologist, his work is about savoring that moment. So it's not letting it go by, the bird, the bald eagle, the moment with the child, but as you're saying, by capturing it, but just taking that extra moment and savoring it. We can't get there unless we are present. And so mindfulness is the foundation of gratitude and a lot of potential joy in our life. And I'm not going to suggest this is easy, because when we're not in a good mood or when we're swamped with negativity or fear, as you're mentioning, the emotions of the heart, if we are not aware of those and giving those space as well, it's easy to get absorbed into those emotions. And I talk a lot about this in terms of the habits of mind, our negativity bias and how we just kind of naturally tend to look at things a little bit pessimistically or kind of sink into the negative emotions rather than the positive ones. So I'm not going to suggest any of this is easy, but the step-by-step process of really almost building the mindfulness muscle and being able to return again and again to this present moment, whether it's sitting and paying attention, or it's taking a walk and paying attention, or driving and paying attention, or washing dishes and paying attention. We have so much opportunity in front of us to actually practice mindfulness.
We do. And, if it's something that people are struggling with to at the start, sometimes it's good to give ourselves something to actually look for. So, because that brings the focus to the moment. And I was, as you were speaking, I was thinking of an interview I recently did with an animal behaviorist for another channel, my other channel, Pet Talk. And she was talking about how she's wanting for people who look at walking with their dogs as a chore, for it to be a pleasant experience so that they are more relaxed, which then helps the dogs to relax and have a nicer walk, rather than having their humans saying, oh, hurry up, and so on. So what she's done is she's created not quite treasure hunts, but she gives them a list of things in nature that they can look for. So when they're out on the walk, they need to look for these specific things, and then report back to her. And of course, everybody, this is enhancing their enjoyment of the walk tremendously. And I just think that that was a genius idea to help people to be in the moment, just like their dogs are, therefore having more of a shared experience that is enjoyable for both the dog and the person. So if you are indeed struggling to be in the moment, maybe give yourself a little goal to achieve, um, in term that is going to engage you in observation.
Yeah. Oh, I love you bringing up the dog example. Um, there are so many reasons for that. I mean, pets in and of themselves can remind us to be present. They are kind of that mindfulness bell that reminds us to just stop for a minute. Um, but it is that when we have a perception of an activity and we perceive it as responsibility versus opportunity, that right there, when we notice that perception, is a perfect mindfulness moment. And my two dogs are my joys and love in life, and I do have the pleasure of walking them every day. They absolutely respond to my energy, absolutely 100%, and I respond to their energy. And it is that awareness in the moment that can help us kind of calibrate together and maximize our time together. And then really pay attention during that walk and just be appreciative for it. But your point about starting points is really important, because this can kind of hang people up from really beginning a mindfulness practice, thinking, oh, I have to sit and meditate for, half an hour every day to be successful at this. And that is absolutely not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a mindful stop during a day. And I have a wonderful acronym for stop that I share in the book that is really about like some kind of intentional halting or pause. The T is actually take a breath, because this is a perfect way to slow down the nervous system, kind of calm things down. The O is for take a moment and observe what is happening in the body. Like, oh, I'm feeling actually a little bit nervous right now, or my body is really tense. And just bringing that awareness, I mean, 99.9% of people just don't even do that during the day. So observing and noticing, observing without judgment. Like if I find that anxiety, instead of like self-flogging and wanting to push it away, opening up a little space for it with kindness. But when we gather that data in our body, we can then go to the P, which is proceed the way that will serve us. It means that we get to make a choice instead of running, or not noticing what we're feeling and just feeling awful, to be able to take that mindful stop so we can make a choice of how we want to be. And this doesn't require a half an hour meditation session. This requires a few moments of just dropping in and bringing awareness. And I find that is a really great starting point. Or taking 3 breaths during the day, maybe twice a day, or sitting quietly and focusing on the breath for 5 minutes, or taking a dog walk and bringing awareness to it, right? There are so many ways we can bring this into our everyday lives.
You were talking about breath, and it's just brought to mind something that I have done with clients who are actually struggling to take breaks because they are based virtually chained to their desks at work. And I have encouraged them every hour or every couple of hours to set an alarm on their phones
Yes.
for them to actually just stop and breathe
Yes.
and be aware of whether there's tension,
Yes.
and if need be, to just go to the toilet to stretch. you
Yeah.
know? So
Find a spot, any spot.
any spot, if you can't do it in front of your colleagues, just nip to the loo where nobody going to watch you and hopefully there's enough room to at least for you to touch your toes, um, or stretch upwards and breathe for a moment, because we get so used to being in that sympathetic nervous system with adrenaline and cortisol being pumped into our bodies that we don't even notice that we're out of kilter. And just by introducing a little alarm that says, time to stop and check. It'll only take 2 to 3 minutes, but it's a big thing. And that mindfulness exercise, that raising of awareness to what's going on in the body, has so many benefits. Particularly, I've noticed in those of my clients who have habits that are destructive. For instance, if they are pulling their hair, or doing anything of the kind, just stopping and noticing, okay, what was that thought I just had? What helps them to begin to unlock the emotion behind the habit so that we can actually start to deal with the emotion. And that brings us to the compassion that you're talking about, because it's so important that it's without judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. We are very harsh on ourselves and we don't recognize it. And oftentimes, one of the ways we react is with blame. And for some of us, our inherent blame strategy is to blame the other person. It's everybody else's fault but mine. And for others of us, the inherent blame strategy is me. I'm a mess. I'm all to blame. But the problem is we don't recognize which strategy. We don't recognize that we are blaming and we're creating further kind of cycles of negativity. And this whole concept of dropping the judgment, I mean, in the most simplistic way, even when I teach mindfulness meditation and it's first time students who sit down for 30 seconds and try to quiet the mind, there inevitably are a handful of people who raised their hand and said, God, I couldn't do it. So I got really frustrated with myself, right? So even in the moment that we're like given this opportunity for some space, we start blaming ourselves and we start judging ourselves. And it is incredibly radical to be able to work with that judgment in a different kind of way. And we can work with that judgment in the same way we work with any emotion that comes up. We can, when we see it, if we're giving ourselves that space to see it with awareness, we can name it. Oh, judgment. I'm judging, right? And instead of then like clamping onto it, attaching to it, and I want to judge more, or like fighting against it, get rid of it, it's really opening space for it. There's a phrase I'm sure you've heard, name it to tame it. If we name that it's there, it kind of loses its power over us. And it's very intentional to be able to name what's coming up. And while this can be a further step down the line, we can move towards it. This whole concept of letting go. Do I need this judgment in this moment? The answer oftentimes is I really don't need this. This is not serving me well. This is not serving anybody else well. What would it feel like to just let it kind of move off like a cloud in the sky? Because that is the way that thoughts work. That is the way that emotions work too, if we're not grasping onto them and holding onto them. And another practice that we use in doing that is very much a loving kindness practice. Like, oh, I'm being harsh on myself. So I'm going to take a moment. And for me, I like to put my hand on my heart and have that somatic contact. Wish myself well. May I be well. May I loosen the reins of judgment today. Doesn't mean like I'm going to stop being judgmental or stop harming myself or others in this way immediately, but may I loosen the reins. May I lighten my load. May I learn to let go. Any phrase that is moving us in the direction of releasing with kindness is a really, really powerful practice.
And before we do that, there is an element of dialogue or engagement too, because if we're talking about listening to what we are feeling with compassion, that is a form of engagement. We have to listen so that when we do that check and we can see that there's tension in our bodies, or for we just had a glimpse of a fleeting anger, or we feel that anger inside of us. I think when we're talking about judgment, it's this notion of labeling. I think labeling is a really good term for it. It's to label something as good or bad. And that's when we say to not have judgment. I think it's there are times when we have to judge whether something is good or bad, but this is not one of them. And it's not in this context that we want this judgment. What we want is understanding. And so we want to get away from labeling good or bad. And actually, what we want is to say it feels good or it feels bad. If it feels good, but I'm not supposed to, it's not supposed to feel good. Now that's guilt. Good. Okay. Now we know it's guilt. So, what is it about it that feels good but is uncomfortable? And if it feels good but it's good, then great, enjoy, savor the moment. But if it's not, if it feels bad, okay, what is it about it that feels bad? So it's actually learning to listen, and it's listening to the feeling. It's not to the thoughts, because the thoughts are usually the source of the labeling, but it's listening to the feeling, and then it's asking the questions. I think one of the things that we really need to start doing is some good critical thinking. And that's not critical as in criticism, but it's critical as in taking apart, analyzing in order to understand, not to judge, as i.e., label, but to understand, so that, gosh, that was quite a twinge. What was going on there? Oh yeah, do you know, every time I hear that person say that, I get this twinge. Huh, that happened last time. Oh, now that's interesting. What is it about hearing them say that that is uncomfortable to me? So this is the thought process. And all of this is living mindfulness.
Yeah, and all of this requires opening up space. And that's really the bottom line. And I would say, I mean, there are four foundations of mindfulness, and we can work through a process where we practice bringing awareness to thoughts, and we begin to get used to recognizing the stories and the thought patterns, and we can neutralize that through bringing awareness over time. There's also the foundation of bringing awareness to emotions. And for many of us, and I think this is what you're talking about, there's a relationship between an emotion and a somatic experience. And spending time having the experience of, where is this playing out in my body? What does this feel like? What kind of pattern is this, right? And bringing compassion into our bodies, into that space, and allowing that emotion to kind of run its course is a really powerful practice. So and then there's mindfulness of breath, and then mindfulness of phenomenon or sensations around us. There are ways to practice with these different kinds of habits and break them down, get familiar with them, also kind of decreasing the way they kind of spin us out into belief systems and behaviors. And this is an important set of practices, and it requires some pauses, it requires some stopping, it requires some listening and paying attention. And I think ultimately what happens is that we can become better at tapping into our inner wisdom when we learn about all of the energies that are constantly flowing around in our bodies, in our minds, our brains. That when we settle and begin to quiet a little bit, all of a sudden we have access to more inner wisdom that's always there and that we just don't even recognize is there sometimes.
Yes, this is, I guess, about becoming attuned with
Yes,
inner selves, or tuning into our inner selves,
yes,
which is one of the gifts of practicing this as a way of being, as a way of life.
yes.
So I was just thinking back to your book, and there you were, already knowing a good deal about this and then forgetting it, which is what happens to all of us when we are in times of stress. So tell us about that, and then tell us about how you got back on track.
Oh, I think that is the story of being a lifelong student. We are on this planet to learn how to, fulfill our life's missions and be better people, right? And these practices are wonderful when life is spacious and easy and we don't have to balance the kids and the work and the, household chores, and things aren't falling apart, and we can go on retreat and we can, do our meditation practice as we'd like. And that never happens. That is not the reality, at least for anyone that I know. Hopefully, people who can live that kind of life. And so, yeah, my story is like everybody else's. I began practicing 20 years ago. And it was extremely revelatory when I was introduced to this idea that I could find some quiet, like I could settle my mind. I could calm my nervous system. Anxiety for me has been a really big teacher. And it was radical that I could work with my anxiety rather than fighting against it and letting it constantly win over me. And the story I tell many stories in the book, but really for me, the biggest kind of kick for my mindfulness practice was having a kid in 2010. Aiden was born, and, as many mothers will, of course, say the same thing, their lives changed so much. And every spare second was being put towards some kind of chore, to the point where I could not even find the space to practice. And this, I will say, is the only time in the 20 years, there was probably about 5 months where I kind of just was like, I give up. I give up because I could not find the formula to take care of myself. But what happened in that process and in the overwhelm of all of it, and I took maternity leave, but I went back to work after 3 months. And in the overwhelm of all of that, I got physically and emotionally depleted to the point where I stopped sleeping. I was suffering from severe insomnia, along with the anxiety, of course. And it really impacted my day to day life, of course. And that to me was my wake up call when I couldn't get a handle on it. And when it felt like things really were falling apart and I just couldn't hold it all together, I really found my way back. And that in part was because a therapist handed me Tara Brach's book, Radical Acceptance, which is the message sometimes we need in these moments, because mindfulness is very much about acceptance. I was, of course, fighting against my perfectionism. Why can't I do this well, right? And being reminded of acceptance and then practicing, going back into a meditation practice and practicing acceptance. And what does that look like now in this new context where things are not going to be perfect or smooth, and it's still going to be overwhelming? I can't change the circumstances, but I can change how I relate to that. All of the circumstances was very life changing for me. I took many, many steps to find my way back to some level of balance, which it's always going to be different. Balance isn't going to look the same in every life stage for us. But it was really the beginning of a deeper learning process around mindfulness for me. And really that was 13, gosh, almost 14 years ago that I started on that journey, which is a big part of the time I've been practicing mindfulness. And if we do not, they say sometimes life is the practice. If we don't take that seriously and recognize that, for mothers, child raising is the practice. Yes, you fail at sitting and doing your daily practice, or, following through with some of those mindfulness commitments you're making, or you fail, in bringing acceptance to the moment, or kindness or compassion to the moment, right? That is the practice. It is recognizing that you get to start again in every moment and bring new awareness to that moment, and bring a new level of compassion and kindness to that moment. So those were many of my hard-earned lessons.
You use the word acceptance.
Mm.
And of course, acceptance is the outcome of not labeling and judging.
Yeah.
When we simply observe and take notice without labeling and judging, that is a practice of acceptance. And I think actually acceptance is at the heart of everything
Yes.
that we're talking about, because there are times when we are in circumstances that are extremely demanding, extremely challenging, and it is not within our gift to change it. And so we become exhausted from the anxiety and the stress and the feeling of powerlessness that we have when we cannot change it. And acceptance is not capitulation. It is a recognition of the reality of the situation. And when we do that, we are so empowered, because we can then shift the focus on the things that are within our power. And I think, there are times when sitting and meditating is just not going to happen. It's just not. You sit down, you're exhausted, you fall asleep. But part of the practice is in accepting that
Absolutely.
without judgment, and saying, okay, all right, well, that certainly didn't work. What can I do to help myself so that I'm helping my body shift back into something resembling a relaxed state, or a normal state of neutrality, because that's what we're aiming for, is a neutral state.
Yeah.
So what you were talking about there is going to be familiar to so many people. This isn't about being good, and it's not about being holy. It's about being present and alive to what's happening, and without giving ourselves a hard time, really, because that defeats the object.
Yeah. I love the way you just framed that. It's not about good or about being holy. It's about being present and kind. And the definition of suffering that I call upon most is wanting things to be different than how they are. And we push so much against the things we don't like. And this creates so much more, experience of pain. In fact, there's a definition that we often talk about in mindfulness circles. Suffering equals pain times resistance. The amount of resistance we have to what's actually happening, the circumstantial pain, equals the amount of suffering that we do. And this is a beautiful definition because it means we actually have control over our level of suffering. It also recognizes that pain is a fact. Life circumstances are going to be difficult, right? but how much are we rejecting or resisting what's happening in the moment can impact how much we struggle.
And I want to stress again, this isn't about defeat, and it's not about capitulation, and it's not about going along with injustice.
No,
It's
absolutely not.
not, it's really not that. If you are in the middle of a war-torn country, and you can't get out,
Yeah.
this is not saying that your situation is, oh, it's okay, really, because it isn't.
No, it's
But it,
acknowledging the reality and the pain
but
of that.
exactly,
Yes.
it's the opposite. It's saying, yeah, this is terrifying. It's
Yes.
it's all of these things, and no,
Yes.
do anything about that. What can I do? What can I do? What is it within my small power in this situation that is going to make a difference to my sanity and to the sanity of others? And that's this is it, isn't it? These are principles by which we live. And we are going to be challenged on our ability to uphold those principles all the way along through any number of circumstances.
Yes.
So it is it really is about acknowledging those moments of powerlessness and fear and pain, anxiety, and treating them with compassion.
And recognizing what we can control. And I'm really grateful you brought up this concept of, you know, this we don't want to set this up as you can control, you can't control your circumstances. And it can be really hard to control how you relate to circumstances when they are dire and heartbreaking. What it does is say, you are human, you are completely capable, when you can, of opening up space to allow yourself to feel, to grieve, to be with whatever is arising without needing to change that. Acceptance doesn't mean we're doormats or we get walked over or we don't step out and fight for the things that are fair and just. But it is a way of working in the moment with the pain and difficulty that we all will experience. And I'll say this as well, the reason why I have worked so hard in this book, in my work, in my teaching, to help to lay a foundation of mindfulness that is really clear and devoid of all of the misconceptions that are in our culture, is because the power of our inner work is not to be underestimated. I believe the power of our inner work is the key to change in the outer world. The problem is that people often skip over that inner work, fighting for change when they are not stable or clear. And that stability and clarity can only come from doing this work. And the quote that I often share around this, I'll just share this quote because this really makes the point, and I feel like this is so important. It's by Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, who writes, "Until we transform ourselves, we are like mobs of angry people screaming for peace. In order to move the world, we must be able to stand still in it." I think that's a
Abs-
challenge for many people.
Absolutely, and it brings to mind when I was training as a hypnotherapist, our teacher um, talking to us about times in which people really are truly stuck in their circumstances.
Yes.
And I remember him saying, what happens if somebody comes to you and they're in a very miserable marriage, but they are unwilling to leave because of the damage it's going to do overall to children, to themselves. He said, we always have a choice. We go, we stay. If we stay, we need help to be resilient. And really, this is exactly what we're talking about here. The purpose of this practice is to help us be resilient. It's not a
Yes.
wand, but it gives us the resilience that we need to be able to deal with the challenges that can at times be overwhelming. But as you've just, that quote is beautiful. And it's that ability to be still that keeps chaos at the door and
Uh,
doesn't come in, that enables us to move forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is exactly the point of the practice. Some people think, oh, it's so selfish. People take this time and just focus on themselves. It's not a selfish practice. If we are not doing this work and centering and becoming aware of how our internal environment is kind of spewed out into the outer world, how can we possibly make changes for the good? Right? And so this is not a small practice.
It isn't. And I think that this interview is a call to action, an action that leads to stillness.
Oh, I love it. That's
So,
beautiful.
just to remind everyone, the title of the book we've been talking about is Meeting the Moment with Kindness. Sue, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me join. And this has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. And if people wanted to find you, how do they do that?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's www.meetingthemoment.org. You can find audio practices if you want to get some guided meditations. I think there are about 20 of those on there. A lot of blog articles, just current thinking about what mindfulness means in this world, and some additional resources on there.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you. I'll be sure to put everything in the description box.
thank you.
And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be talking about how to empower women to, well, give birth in the way that they choose. Until next time, goodbye.